And so part of what they learned and what they had to contend with was living in an environment where it was very harsh, very cold, very short planting seasons. They were considered supreme deer hunter when they were deer around, and they worshiped trees. These are the things we know about what is known as barbaric Europe during that period of time. Now I want you to contrast that with the African and the Latino axiology, which is man to man, member to member. Highest value lies in the relationship between people. 5,000 to 8,000 years ago, tropical Africa, South America, how much time do you have to plant and grow your food? So what's the rush? We're not going to rush because we have plenty of time. We have plenty of time. Not only that, we have plenty of resources. If we run out of, roots, we'll fish. If we don't fish, we'll pick berries, but we'll get it done. And so we have a very different frame of reference and much of the focus. And of course, it had more to do than with food. It had more to do than just looking about and seeing what those physical resources was, but it had to do with what were the human resources necessary to survive. And those human resources were a collective, hence tribe, hence the notion of village. And so as African people, the primary value system that we had was one of being together. Now this is perfectly illustrated in something as simple as greeting. Every cultural group has its own greeting. How do Asians greet traditionally? They bow, right? When you begin to look at a very different thing, you look at European greeting. And European greeting, again, it's a reflection of their primary value systems. And their greetings is perfunctory. It's a perfunctory greeting. Hello, how are you? How do you do? How do you do what? My white friends are going, okay, Joy, it was just a greeting. That's all it was. Say hello. Because it's perfunctory. It's not, it's just a formality. You kind of got to do it. Okay, now when Africans and Latinos greet, it's ceremonial, is it not? Think about it. We greet in ways that I don't think anybody else on the planet greets. I'm going to test it out today. Sir, could you stand up over here on the end? This brother here, stand up. Stand on up. Come on, stand on up. Okay. Let's see. Let's find somebody over here that, this brother here in the gray. Could you stand up, please, sir? Yes, you. And could you come over and greet this man? Could you meet him halfway and go in and greet him? Just want you to greet him. What I'm trying to say, as you know, it can get into a snap and slap and all kind of stuff goes on, right? And Latinos will pick you up, kiss you, or slap you in the face, all kind of stuff goes on, right? Because the greeting is to establish the what? The relationship. Highest value lies in the relationship, right? So these are things that become very important, and it's something that has transferred beyond one generation. It's gone over generations. It's not like someone taught you that, really. When you're walking down the street and in the grocery store and you go, whenever I used to have my white friends with me, they go, Joy, you know so many people. How you know? I don't know them people, but I'm going to greet them. And greeting becomes something very important. And you think about it, even your children, when you have children, can you come in the house and walk past Aunt Dolores? Not and live. Didn't you see Aunt Dolores? And then you got people, you try to not acknowledge somebody that you know when you're out. Oh, wait a minute, you too good to speak? You too good? All kinds of stuff can go awry with that, right? So greeting becomes very important. Now I want you to consider something else. I want you to consider what something like American chattel slavery did to the relationship. A people whose whole existence, fundamental to their survival, was their relationships. There was nothing that could have more devastated a group of people whose primary value system was the relationship than American chattel slavery. It destroyed and devastated relationships. One of the most horrific and vile things that could have occurred. So, I started to take a look at that impact on a group of people. It would have been different for any other group, but for African people, for American chattel to slavery to exist, devastated the very foundation of the existence of African culture. And this is something we need to know. And yet, still we rise. It's phenomenal that we have. So I decided to take a look at this thing, this injury. I wanted to understand it because the first thing I started to realize is that it morphed into something that no one seemed to acknowledge. Because whenever I talk about slavery, and I'll tell you, you get reactions when you say slavery, don't you? People, the first thing they want to do is almost like the Million Man March. When the Million Man March happened, I'll never forget this. The first thing they did was found some black people to say it wasn't a good thing. Before it could be over with, they had people on television telling you how bad it was. And the first thing that happens when slavery comes out of the mouth of someone African or from African descent, well, that's all over now. That has nothing to do with, that's all over. First thing that happens, they want to shut you down immediately. And to me, that's the first indicator that I need to pay attention to it. So they said, well, you know, Joy, that was a long time ago. Slavery's over. Get over it. I wasn't even there. I didn't do it. I'm tired of being guilty about it. I didn't do it. I don't want to hear about it. I wasn't there. I didn't do it. And that's true. I wasn't there either. I didn't do it. But you've got to know that 246 years of official slavery guaranteed that the progeny of the South, the white progeny, would have wealth for generations to come. And that the black progeny of the slaves would incur a debt that we have yet to shake off. So it doesn't matter if either of us was there. If we were there or not, it doesn't matter because the impact of that is present today. And that's the part that no one wants to talk about. That's the part that becomes uncomfortable to talk about. But we must talk about it if we are to lance the boil. So what I started to do is I started to try to understand it in the context of what I know people do. Now, a lot of people look at this, and it's not like, there are many people that have discussed these things. But this is the first time we've ever discussed it on the level where we start telling the truth to the point where people start squirming. Because we got to tell the truth on this one. How many of you are familiar with Dante's Inferno? Dante's Inferno is a story about a man who takes a trek through hell. And it was said that the hottest places in hell were reserved for those who were faced with a moral dilemma and decided to remain neutral. And what I understand about this issue is people desire to remain neutral. And we cannot any longer. Our children are dependent upon us telling the truth. So let's tell the truth about slavery. Because like most people, we look at it as Africans, and and descendants of Africans, we have strange feelings about it. Yet there's something intrinsic in who we are that knows that it's true. So let's take a look at some of the things that we need to look at. We need to look at our history books. We need to first look at what most of you are familiar with out there, because everything speaks to this notion of race, and that we have had problems with it for a long time. So let's go to the Bible. And let's go to Numbers 12, if you want to know where it is. It's not obscure. In Numbers 12, verse 1, it says, "And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married." Moses had a black wife, and Miriam and Aaron didn't like it. It goes on to say that they kindled the wrath of God. God became angry and smite Miriam with leprosy because she didn't like Moses' black wife. And as much as I hear all the rhetoric about the problems that are existing within the African American community and anti-Semitism and all of that, nobody mentioned that Moses' wife was black, that we're probably cousins. How did we miss that one? I don't think Charlton Heston had a black wife when he did Moses. I looked. And if you're going to stay true to the story, it's not like it's obscure. Now, the only time I've ever seen it done truthfully, and I waited to see, was a full-length cartoon. And it wasn't Disney. Disney, well, that was too controversial, I guess, even in cartoon form. Wouldn't do it. It was a full-length cartoon. And indeed, I waited. And Moses' wife was black. Broad nose, thick hair. Even Moses was a little brown. Okay? Just a little brown. Of course, when he received the full revelation, he was completely white. Completely white. But I had to give him some props. Give him some props, Moses' wife. So what we understand is, in a biblical way, we have been struggling with this issue. We've been struggling with it. And we won't tell the truth about it. Then we understand that, at least for me and my family, when you really, I come from a family of people that, my father really taught us to express what we believe, what we felt, albeit respectfully, but say it in a way that, people understand that that's what you really feel. So we tend to speak kind of all at once, okay? And you got to jump in there in my family. And you just got to get above the highest octave, whatever that is. And so when we get intense and we want to prove a point, we say to people, I know I'm right on this because I read it in a book, which presumably means it's what? It must be the truth. It's written in a book. And then if you can't find it in a book, then of course you have to up the ante, and then you move it up to, it's a scientific fact, what I'm saying to you here. Of course I'm right, it's scientific fact. So what I did was I went in fact to the literature, and I went to science, those two areas that we tend to worship in this country. And so when I looked at one of those heroes that we've made our literary heroes, is William Shakespeare. What did he have to say? Now, William Shakespeare was a reflection of his day. He talked about, in his plays, he talked about what he believed and what he saw. And one of the things that he did was he dealt with the idea of miscegenation. That's race mixing, right? Which is taboo. And I'm going to talk about why it's a taboo. Shakespeare often dealt with racial mixing, the miscegenation issue. In his first tragedy, Titus Andromachus, the black Moor Aaron had an illegitimate child by his white lover, Tamora. When the nurse first saw the child, she exclaimed, "A devil, a joyless, dismal, black, and sorrowful issue as loathsome as a toad among the fairest breeders of our time." In Love's Labor Lost, the king declares, "Black is the badge of hell, the hue of the dungeons, and the suit of night." And Macbeth curses his servant, saying, "The devil damn thee black." And of course, all of his tragedies, the worst of all was, of course, Othello, where predictably it ends in the destruction of both Desdemona and Othello, and it's packed full of negative imagery around blackness. So we need to begin to understand the etiology of how it is we've come to look at this blackness so negatively. Why is that so? These are God's choice of colors. How could it be? What does it mean? What does it create when you're dealing with someone that's not black? When you're dealing with someone, for example, that's white? So I went again to some literature and I wanted to see, is this happening on a pervasive level? I want you to know something, that whenever people oppress another group of people, it doesn't matter who they are, women, people of color, it doesn't matter who the group is, they have to remove the cognitive dissonance. Because if you're a good person, you render yourself a good person. You say that I'm a fair person, I'm a moral person, I'm a spiritual person. I don't do things that are bad to people, like, hello, enslave them. I don't do things that are mean and horrific. So in order for me to feel good about myself, I have to remove the cognitive dissonance, and I do this by, number one, justifying my behavior to ease the mind. And I justify that behavior by relabeling the people. I give them another label, then I can feel okay about who I am. I want to read this, and I want you to know that this was taken out of a 4th grade textbook in Oregon. And it was taken off the shelf by a gentleman by the name of Daryl Milner, who's the head of Black Studies. Daryl Milner took this off of the shelf. But for years, in late 80s, 85, he took it off the shelf. But nobody knew that there was anything wrong with it. I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it, and we're going to see if you're going to catch it. Because he read it over and over again to the then social studies teachers who didn't notice there was anything wrong with it. And it remained for many years. It starts off by saying environment, and then in big letters, John Muir. Have you ever visited Mount Rainier, the Grand Canyon, the Petrified Forest, or Yosemite? These places are all national parks today, in part because of the work of one man, John Muir. In the 1800s, millions of people began living in parts of the United States where no one had ever lived before. To make their livings, people chopped down forests to have lumber for building and to clear land for farming. People put dams across rivers, they built roads, bridges, and railroads, and they dug mines. He read it over and over again. In the 1800s, millions of people began living in the parts of the United States where no one had ever lived before. Now, either Native Americans are not human beings, or they're simply not worthy of mention. Are you following me? They read it over and over again. Nothing's missing here. But what happened to the Native American child sitting in that classroom? And what are the possibilities that they would confront that inaccuracy? Again, the attempt to erase. But why would you want to erase this group of people? What dissonance does it produce for you? What have you done to them? I want you to stay with me there. I simply look at this as something that's trivial. I eliminate it, I erase it, because it creates what for me? Cognitive dissonance. We look at even the terms that are used in history, who the heroes are. We look at what they did. They would go in and slaughter people, but those were called victories. And when the Native Americans fought back, it was called massacres. So we have to understand the words that we use have a lot to do with how we perceive things, because words hurt, don't they? There's something about words that stay with us. And I want you to remember that as we move through. So then I had to take a look at these things, and I'm going, so Joy, what exactly are we talking about? So I went to school. I went and got first of all, I want to say I have a lot of degrees, but I don't particularly like school, okay? I ended up staying in there because I had difficulties with a lot of stuff. So I ended up with a lot of degrees because I was confused about a lot of stuff. But when I was going for my master's degree in clinical psychology, I was pursuing a side degree or a PhD in psychology. And I just figured out I didn't like psychology. I didn't like what it did to people. I didn't like the labels that it used because, you know, psychology was born out of, I think, and psychiatry actually, the need to get paid. Come on. There's a book called the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, right? And if you bill insurance, you better have a code. So if you don't have a sickness, I'm going to give you one because that's the only way I'm going to get paid. Now, surely there's something called mental illness. I wouldn't trivialize that. That's true. We do have a lot of mental illness. But I had a real problem with how people, quote, treated it. And one of the things that came up that people, my teachers would talk about, there was a couple of things, but one of the things they would talk about is post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's a long time ago, so I looked at post-traumatic stress disorder. I said, well, now, that seems pretty interesting. And the first thing I wanted to know about post-traumatic stress disorder is, well, who gets it? And what is this thing? Actually, post-traumatic stress disorder was born out of shell shock. How many of you are familiar with that term, shell shock? And shell shock is one of those things that happened, for lack of a better word, they didn't know what to call it, for veterans, people who were in war that would come back and they'd have these behaviors because they were, looking at people getting killed and this sort of thing. So I wanted to see who they listed. And these are the folks they listed that apparently had traumas as a result of some major stressor. Identify groups. This is in that book called the DSM. Victims of rape, war veterans, heart attack victims. I'm going to talk about that one for a minute. Victims of natural disaster and victims of severe accidents. That's who's listed. And heart attack victims are often listed because when a person has a heart attack, their greatest fear is that the next one's going to do what? Right. So it creates a certain level of a stress. So they end up with... So I said, well, where are the slaves? Seems to me slaves ought to be on here. And when I brought that to my professors, they said, oh, no, that was too long ago. Wait a minute. That couldn't work. I'm going, well, it just seems to me they ought to be there, right? So, I had a lot of problems in my program, For example, one of the things I asked them is, we studied Freud, Rogers, and everybody, all the theorists, all of whom were men, all of whom were white men, and most of their patients were white women, still are. So I started to look at that behavior, and I was questioning that. I said, now tell me this. I'm just curious, and I brought this up at one of those meetings where they had the faculty and the graduate students, and they wanted to have inclusion. So they wanted to help us get to a feeling of everyone being included. So I said, I have a question for you. I said, I want you to consider every single person that has been healed as a result of, psychotherapy and psychodynamic therapy and whatever theory you want. All of them, Adler, everybody, bring them in. I want you to consider everyone that says, I did this and then I was healed. And I want you to compare that number to the number of people on the planet that said, I had faith. I had a God and I knew it wasn't me. How many of them believe that that is what healed them? And there was a little hush, okay? And they were going, well, it's, can't measure that. I go, oh, yeah, we can. We can measure that. Ask people, right? So I'm in the room with the people. I said, is it not a fact that there are more people that have been healed as a result of what they believe in their heart and their faith and prayer than what all of these combined theorists came up with? That's why I knew I had to go. I wasn't going to make it there very long because they didn't want to deal with that truth. They don't want to deal with that truth. Instead, you get in and they erase spirituality. Or they try to figure out how to package it and sell it. So then I asked this question about slaves. And they said it was too long ago. I said, well, why was it too long ago to diagnose? Well, because post-traumatic stress disorder only occurs over a period of time for a person that has experienced a trauma. I said, okay. So let's look at what happens. What are the kinds of things that people begin to behave like? This is what they would behave like if you have post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, you all know in New York, because of 9/11. When 9/11 happened, the entire country was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. But not everybody had post-traumatic stress disorder based on those buildings coming down. It was a tragic event, but not everybody was traumatized by that. Matter of fact, I would submit to you that there were folks traumatized long before that. But there was something that happened when people saw those objects crumble. And what those objects represented to America, what they were a symbol of, the World Trade Center. It wasn't just the lives that were lost. It was the symbol of what it meant. And that was wrapped in the notion of power and control and stability, all of those things, greatness. So many people experience post-traumatic stress disorder. Some people can't get on airplanes today, and they were nowhere near New York. So I understand that people experience that. Now let's see how they behave when they have been traumatized. Intense psychological stress and distress at the exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the trauma or the traumatic event. So I would imagine that if people, were walking around and they were around tall buildings or they saw airplanes going over, that this would trigger, are you following me? Physiological reactivity to exposure to the external or internal event. So again, you'd have a physical response. Marked diminished interest or of participation in significant activities. This is a person no longer wants to do things. Feeling of detachment or estrangement from others, restricted range of affect, unable to have loving feelings, a sense of foreshortened future, does not expect to have a career, marriage, children, or a normal lifespan, difficulty falling or staying asleep, irritability or outbursts of anger, difficulty concentrating, hypervigilance, exaggerated startle response. These are the behaviors of an individual that's been traumatized. These are the symptoms that they are living with. So they go to a doctor and they try to get us some medications. And if you're poor and don't know about that, you self-medicate. So this is what people do. And I'm going, okay, that makes sense to me. Now let's see. Let's look at the diagnostic features of post-traumatic stress disorder. These are what the most common trauma involved. And so once again, I said to my professors, but are you saying that slaves didn't have this? They said, Joy, that was too long ago. I said, okay. So what I started to do, like I asked my audiences to do, let's take a look at what these features are, and you and I will determine if maybe some of the slaves had it. Because they constantly tell us how happy we were during slavery. Even if you pick up any textbook in our schools, they'll show you happy slaves. Won't they? Nice little cabin, folks playing the banjo, happily eating pig entrails and watermelon, grateful for the master. Isn't that what they show us? Because we need to see those pictures because we need to remove the what? The cognitive dissonance. We need to believe that the way we treated you was just like, and you was happy about it too. That's why those pictures are there. So I'm going to give them that. All three of the slaves that were happy, and even the few that are still happy today. I'm going to give you them. So now, let's look at this and let's determine if in fact, and the thing about the DSM, because you need to be able to get the money, right? So if a person is diagnosed with dysthymia, which is, a kind of recurring depression, ongoing depression, chronic depression, you don't have to have all the features of depression, for example, to get that diagnosis. You only need a couple of them. Okay, maybe one you can get, So I want you to bear in mind that you didn't have to have all of these to get the diagnosis. But I want you to tell me if you think outside of the three happy slaves, I want you to tell me if you think the rest of them might have experienced these. A serious threat to or a harm to one's life or physical integrity. They get that one. Threat or harm to one's children, spouse, or close relatives. Sudden sudden destruction of one's home or community. Seeing another person injured, killed as a result of an accident or physical violence. Learning about a serious threat to a close friend, a relative kidnapped, tortured, or killed. Stressor is experienced with intense fear, terror, and helplessness. Disorder is considered to be more serious and will last longer when the stressor is of human design. That's 7 out of 7. You think they might have had it? Of course they did. And do you remember how I described exaggerated startle response, difficulty staying or falling asleep, outbursts of anger, exaggerated emotions is what we're talking about. A person that doesn't see a future for themselves. I want you to consider that person. And so everyone would agree that slaves had it. Did they treat the slaves when they had it? So during that time, did the master say, I notice you've been stressed lately. I'm thinking you need a little help. You think? No, they didn't get any help. And did they experience one trauma? Now understand that there were people that weren't there in New York when it occurred. They were somewhere in New Zealand watching it on TV, and they need to go to therapy behind it. So how is it we think that these people who lived a lifetime of trauma, that they did not suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder? So I think most would agree it doesn't take, it's not even plausible to assume they didn't have it. That's plain foolish. That's called, it has face validity. So now we know they had it. And how long did slavery last? Okay, they had it over a duration, and then when mother had it, because that was mom and dad and aunt and everybody else who had it, raising Johnny, yes? So Johnny was dealing with someone that had difficulty staying or falling asleep, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future and doom. That was mama raising Johnny. And did Johnny get some traumas? And did little Mary get some traumas? And that's what they named us. So what I'm trying to say and what I began to do is not far-fetched. It's not some rugged emotionalism that I'm talking about here. This makes sense. It simply makes sense. So now that we know it makes sense that the slaves had it, they say, but Joy, that was so long ago. Y'all been free. Y'all free now.